The cabin sat at the edge of a forgotten clearing, its walls bowed slightly from years of frost and thaw. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and silence. Sunlight pushed weakly through the boarded windows, landing in narrow stripes across a floor that hadn't felt footsteps in more than a decade. Arlo Finch was there to inspect it, a simple job, or so he thought. He moved through each room, testing the structure, noting where the wood had softened. But in the corner near the old iron stove, one plank looked different, warped, a subtle rise, as if the floor itself was breathing. He knelt down, pressed his palm against the seam. The wood was cool, slightly damp. Then something white shifted in the gap. A maggot thickened slow, pushing upward toward the light. Another followed, wriggling into view. Finch froze. The sound reached him then, a faint, sticky hum of flies coming from somewhere below. His pulse began to hammer in his ears. He fetched his pry bar from the toolbox outside, slid it under the plank, and leaned his weight. The nails groaned, and the board lifted with a sharp crack. What came out first was the smell. Not strong at first, just a whisper of rot, sweet and metallic, like meat left too long in cold air. Then the full breath of it rolled upward from the darkness. He staggered back, gagging, flashlight trembling in his hand. Below the floorboards, the earth had been disturbed. The beam of light swept across what looked like layered cloth, old tarp stiffened by age and soil. And beneath the folds, the shape of a shoulder. Pale, leathery skin stretched tight over bone. Finch stumbled outside into the blinding daylight, gasping for air. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. Within hours, the quiet clearing that had stood empty for 14 years filled with uniforms, cameras, and tape. The address matched a case the locals still whispered about, the family who vanished in 1994. A husband, a wife, 3 children. They'd been living off-grid, far from anyone, and one day they were simply gone. For years, everyone said the wild had taken them, that the mountains swallowed what they wanted to keep. But as investigators knelt over the open floor, shining lights into the hollow beneath, one thing became clear. It wasn't the wilderness that had hidden them. It was the house itself. The truth had been waiting there all along, quiet, patient, and buried just inches beneath their own floor. The year was 1994, and the Alaskan interior was already stiffening beneath the first hint of winter. Frost clung to the branches like powdered glass, and the air carried that hollow stillness that comes just before snow. Miles from the nearest paved road, Jacob Harroway and his wife Maren had built the kind of life most people only dream about and few could survive. They lived beyond the grid. No phone, no electricity, no neighbors, just a cabin Jacob had raised with his own hands, 2 acres of cleared ground for a garden and a well that tapped the earth's cold veins for water. He was 38, once an engineer in Anchorage, before he'd decided that civilization was the real wilderness. Maren, 3 years younger, had followed him without hesitation, trading textbooks for soil and classrooms for a wood stove and the long blue silence of northern nights. Their 3 children, Lydia, 8, Rowan, 6, and little Eli, 4, knew no other world. They learned to read by lantern light, to count using the rings of birch trees, to tell time by the shape of the mountains. They were healthy, happy, and self-sufficient, or at least that's what the photographs later showed. Each autumn, before the heavy snows sealed the forest, Jacob's mother Evelyn made the trip from Fairbanks. She was 65 that year, still driving the same battered Jeep she'd bought 2 decades earlier. It was always a 2-day journey, gravel roads giving way to logging tracks. then to paths that existed only because someone had once driven over the moss often enough to flatten it. Every visit was both reunion and farewell. Once winter set in, the Harroways would be unreachable until spring. Evelyn had made the drive so many times she knew every bend, every fallen tree, every washout where the tires slipped and bit again. But that October, the trip felt different. The sky was the color of tin, low and heavy, and the radio lost its signal long before she left the last town behind. The forest seemed to press closer around the Jeep, swallowing the road, muting the sound of the engine. By the time she reached the clearing, dusk was already creeping between the trees. She expected the usual sight: a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a lantern glowing behind the window panes, maybe the muffled bark of the family's dog rushing out to greet her. Instead, there was only silence. The cabin stood perfectly still. The garden was harvested, the firewood stacked in neat rows, the tools cleaned and hung under the porch eaves. It should have been comforting, proof of Jacob's discipline and care, but the quiet was wrong. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn stepped out of the Jeep, boots crunching on the frost. "Jacob?" she called. Her voice came back to her smaller than before. She tried again, louder this time. "Marin? Kids?" But the sound scattered uselessly into the trees. She climbed the porch steps and knocked. The door swung inward with a reluctant creak. It hadn't been locked. Inside, everything was precisely in order. The table was set for dinner, 2 plates stacked neatly, utensils shining in the dim light. Coats hung from their pegs. The beds were made, sheets stretched smooth. On the shelf above the stove sat Marin's notebook, open to a page half filled with neat handwriting. Inventory complete: flour, salt, canned beans, kerosene. The pencil lay across the page as if set down only minutes before. Evelyn walked through each room, her unease deepening. There were no signs of panic, no toppled chairs, no broken glass, yet there was also no sign of life. The hearth was cold. The last ashes in the stove had gone gray weeks ago. Outside, she circled the clearing with a flashlight as darkness fell. The chicken coop stood empty, doors unlatched but unbroken. The garden was stripped bare, the soil already stiff with frost. No tire marks led away from the cabin, no footprints marked the ground. It was as though the family had dissolved into the air. Back inside, she sat for a long time at the kitchen table, listening. Every tick of cooling wood sounded like footsteps that weren't there. When she finally rose, she left the lamp burning, a small defiance against the dark, and stepped back into the Jeep. The drive out was slower, more dangerous. Fog had settled low, blurring the headlights into white halos. The forest that had always seemed vast now felt predatory, closing in around her. She gripped the wheel so tightly, her fingers ached. Somewhere between the switchbacks, she realized she was whispering to herself. Not prayers exactly, just fragments of memory. Jacob's laugh, the children's voices, Marin humming over the stove. By the time the road widened and the first signs of power lines reappeared, she knew the truth she didn't want to name. Whatever had happened in that cabin hadn't been an accident of weather or wilderness. Something human had come for them. When she reached the nearest ranger outpost, frost coated the Jeep like armor. She stepped inside, cheeks red, eyes hollow, and said the words that would open one of Alaska's strangest missing family cases. "My son's gone," she told the officer at the desk. "All of them are gone." Within 24 hours of Evelyn Harroway's report, the Alaska State Troopers launched a full-scale search. The case of a missing off-grid family was rare enough to draw attention from Fairbanks to Anchorage. and soon the wilderness around the Harroway property was alive with the sound of rotor blades and snowmobiles. Helicopters skimmed the treetops, their searchlights cutting thin white beams through the mist. Ground teams followed every frozen track, marking coordinates with orange tape that fluttered like lost prayer flags in the wind. Volunteers from nearby towns joined in, hunters, trappers, old friends of Jacob who knew the terrain better than any map ever could. They searched the riverbanks first. The Harroway's truck, a mud green Ford with a winch mounted to the front, had to have gone somewhere. Tire ruts were found leading downhill toward a bend in the Chena River, then abruptly ended where the soil turned to hard gravel. The current was shallow that season, but the water moved fast enough to hide anything that fell into it. For days, divers in thick neoprene combed the icy flow, surfacing with nothing but branches and silt. Farther north, another team found remnants of an old campfire, charred logs, a rusted coffee pot, and what looked like a child's mitten half buried in snow. The site was logged and photographed, but the prints around it had already blurred into the frozen ground. There was no way to tell when the fire had burned or who had sat beside it. Inside the cabin, troopers cataloged what Evelyn had already seen. The pantry shelves were heavy with canned beans, dried fish, and jars of preserves. Bedding was folded, tools oiled, rifles stacked neatly in the corner, except for one, Jacob's hunting rifle, which was missing. That absence quickly became the focal point of every theory, because nothing looked violent, no overturned furniture, no blood, no shattered glass. The cabin wasn't treated as a crime scene. No fingerprints were taken, no soil scraped from beneath the planks, no samples collected from the well or the stove. The search was focused outward, toward the endless wilderness, not inward toward the place where the family had last been seen alive. The official assumption formed quickly and hardened like ice. Jacob, perhaps worried about the coming storm, had tried to take his family back toward civilization. Somewhere along the way, their truck had broken down or veered off the road. In the sub-zero cold, even the smallest mistake could mean death within hours. To the investigators, it was tragic but simple, another wilderness accident. Evelyn listened to the explanations in silence, her hands clenched in her lap. She'd seen her son in every season of his life, cautious, methodical, the kind of man who checked a map 3 times before taking a step. He'd built his house to survive anything: insulated walls, a hand-dug root cellar, emergency supplies that could last through blizzards. He didn't panic. He didn't leave doors open or rifles behind. She told the troopers that over and over, but their faces never changed. To them, Jacob was just another homesteader who'd underestimated Alaska. Days stretched into weeks. The search grid expanded, then shrank again as fuel and daylight ran short. The temperature fell below 0, and the ground froze so hard that shovel blades sparked against it. Dogs began limping from ice-cut paws, and volunteers returned home one by one. By early November, the wilderness itself had become an enemy. Snow buried the tire ruts. The river crusted over with ice. Even the helicopters stopped flying. The winds were too unpredictable. The search leaders held a final meeting in a temporary operations tent and decided there was nothing more to find. Evelyn was there when they told her. She stood outside the tent afterward, watching the men pack away maps and radio gear. Around her, the trees creaked under the weight of new snow, and the last of the daylight drained from the sky. "They'll call it exposure," one of the younger troopers said quietly, as if to comfort her. "That's how it always goes out here. People think they can outlast the land. The land always wins." Evelyn looked past him toward the dark line of forest. "You don't know my son," she said. The land respected him, but no one wrote that down. 2 weeks later, the official report was finalized, presumed deceased, likely weather-related event. The paperwork closed the case neatly, efficiently. One more family swallowed by Alaska's unforgiving wild. Evelyn drove home through the same maze of roads in silence, the Jeep's headlights tunneling through flurries of snow. When she reached the first gas station with a payphone, she called the trooper post again, asking if there was any update. There wasn't. She called the week after, and the week after that, until the dispatcher stopped taking her number. Winter came early that year. The roads to the Harroway cabin vanished beneath 6 feet of snow, and with them any chance of more searching. The file was moved to the inactive cabinet. In spring, when the rivers thawed and the air filled with meltwater and the cry of ravens, Evelyn drove back to the clearing alone. The cabin stood exactly as she'd left it, the same stacked wood, the same nailed-shut windows, nothing disturbed. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar smoke and cold metal. On the table lay Marin's notebook, the same pencil resting across the page. Evelyn picked it up and ran her thumb along the groove it had made in the paper, as if she could feel the warmth of the hand that had set it there. The silence was deeper than before. Outside, the snowmelt ran in narrow streams through the clearing, carrying leaves and ash into the woods. Evelyn stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the water and the wind, and realized what she already knew. They hadn't been lost in the wilderness. They had been taken from their home, and whatever had done it had left the door unlocked behind them. The Harroway cabin stood through 10 Alaskan winters without its family. Snow pressed against the walls until the logs cracked. Wind whistled through the chimney that had once poured out the smell of wood smoke and stew. When spring came, meltwater streaked the windows in gray lines, and moss crept higher along the foundation stones. Yet somehow the cabin never fell. Evelyn made sure of that. Every year she made the pilgrimage, slowly now, her hands stiff with arthritis, the old Jeep coughing at every hill. She patched the roof with tar, cleared the chimney, replaced warped boards on the porch. The work was more than maintenance, it was ritual. Keeping the cabin standing meant keeping the memory of her son alive. Each visit hurt a little more. The silence inside the house pressed heavier on her chest each year. Once she thought she heard children's laughter echo faintly from the woods, and had to sit down on the steps until the shaking in her hands stopped. In her heart, she still waited for Jacob to appear at the tree line, axe over his shoulder, with that quiet half smile he used when he caught her worrying too much. But time, like the snow, buried even the strongest hopes. By the spring of 2008, Evelyn was 79. Her knees ached after the drive, and she could barely haul the generator out of the Jeep. The forest had reclaimed most of the road. Young birches grew where tire ruts used to be. She knew this was the last time she'd make it here. She cleaned the interior one final time, dust rising in golden shafts through the still air. Then she stood in the doorway, staring at the neat table, the unused beds, the children's wooden toys lined on a shelf. Everything looked exactly as it had the day she found it, only older, like a photograph fading under sunlight. She whispered goodbye, locked the door, and placed a small for sale notice in the Fairbanks newspaper the following month. For a long time, there were no replies. Remote land didn't sell easily, especially land shadowed by a tragedy no one wanted to talk about. But in July, a message reached her through a local realtor. A man named Arlo Finch was interested. Arlo was 42, a carpenter from Anchorage who specialized in restoring old wilderness cabins. He'd spent years working on backcountry lodges and ranger stations, places so remote they were closer to ghosts than homes. He said he didn't mind the property's history. In fact, it intrigued him. He wanted a place to rebuild, something quiet, disconnected from the chaos of town life. Evelyn warned him it wasn't an easy drive. He told her that was exactly why he wanted it. 2 weeks later, Arlo set out alone in his pickup, loaded with tools and fuel. The road narrowed to a trail long before he reached the clearing. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, he stopped the truck and stared for a while. It didn't look abandoned so much as paused, like a film still, waiting for someone to hit play. He stepped out, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The place was silent, except for the hiss of wind through spruce branches. The boards creaked under his boots as he crossed the porch. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. Sunlight fell in thin stripes across the floor, highlighting every imperfection in the boards. He ran his fingers along the walls, testing the joints, listening for hollows that would tell him where the rot had begun. The structure was sound, stronger than most he'd seen from that era. Whoever had built it knew their craft. Still, he made notes in his pad. Roof, replace first. Foundation, solid. Floor, slight warping near stove corner. That corner drew his attention. The plank there bulged upward, a subtle curve no wider than his hand. It could have been swelling from moisture or something trapped beneath. He crouched to get a closer look. When his fingertips brushed the seam, a faint movement caught his eye. Something small, white, and alive. It wriggled, then disappeared back between the boards. Arlo frowned, leaning closer. A soft hum, barely audible, rose from below, the sound of flies. He straightened, heart thudding. The air in the cabin suddenly felt heavier, as if every molecule of dust had stopped moving. He stepped back, staring at the warped plank. For a long time, he didn't breathe. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, and a raven called somewhere in the distance. Arlo grabbed his toolbox. Whatever was under that floor, he told himself, it was probably a dead animal. Maybe a trapped fox, a raccoon. But the sound, that low living buzz, stayed with him as he pried open the first board. It was the moment the silence of 14 years finally broke. When Arlo Finch pried up that warped plank, the stench hit him like a living thing. It pushed through the narrow cracks and wrapped around the room, a smell too deep to belong to any animal. He staggered back, choking on the sweetness of decay. When he dared to look again, the beam of his flashlight fell across what looked like layers of tarps, stiff and dark with age. Beneath them, the outline of a body waited, still and impossibly intact. Arlo dropped the board and ran outside, gulping the cold air as if he'd surfaced from deep water. He fumbled with his phone until his fingers stopped shaking long enough to dial the troopers. When the dispatcher asked for details, all he managed was, There's someone under the floor." Within hours, the cabin that had stood untouched for more than a decade was ringed with yellow tape. Patrol trucks filled the clearing, and floodlights cast long, sterile beams through the trees. The silence that had once wrapped the place in grief was replaced by the hum of generators and the crunch of boots on frozen soil. Forensic technicians moved with practiced calm. They pulled up more planks, widening the opening inch by inch. The air that escaped was cold, thick, and sweetly rotten. When the body was finally lifted from the ground, the blankets that had once covered it disintegrated at the edges, revealing the remains of a woman. Her limbs were drawn inward, hands close to her chest, as if she'd been curled into herself. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Dahl, crouched beside the recovery team. "That's a long time to be lying in permafrost," he murmured. "It's a wonder she's still in one piece." The pathologist on site nodded. "Cold ground does strange things, preserves as much as it destroys." By dusk, the remains were sealed in a thick plastic shroud and flown by helicopter to the medical examiner's office in Fairbanks. The forensic unit stayed behind, documenting every nail and fiber of the space beneath the floor. They noted how the soil had been disturbed, packed unevenly, suggesting a hurried burial. Word of the discovery spread fast. Local news crews braved the muddy roads to film from a distance, zoom lenses catching flashes of white suits against the cabin's dark wood. Within days, the story hit national headlines. "Body found beneath cabin of missing family, husband still at large." The remains were confirmed as Maren Harroway through dental records. She had been 35 when she vanished. The medical examiner's report was blunt. One bullet to the chest, close range, no other wounds. The slug had lodged in her rib cage and been preserved by the cold. Ballistics matched it to a hunting rifle registered to her husband, Jacob. The narrative wrote itself. After 14 years, the case that had gone cold was suddenly red hot again. The troopers called it a clear domestic tragedy. They theorized that Jacob, under the stress of isolation, had snapped, shot his wife, buried her beneath the cabin, and fled with the children into the wilderness. The missing truck and the untouched cabin fit the picture perfectly. Newspapers printed the same photo that had once been used on the missing posters. The Harroways smiling in front of their home, Jacob's arm around Maren's shoulder, 3 blonde children grinning between them. This time, the headline was darker. "Off-grid father turns killer." Evelyn Harroway saw the story on the evening news. She turned off the television halfway through and sat in silence for a long time. She had spent 14 years defending her son's name, and now the world had made him a murderer. But not everyone was convinced. Detective Rowan Keene, newly assigned to the reopened case, watched the same footage in his office. He'd worked homicides long enough to know when something felt too tidy. The crime scene told a story that didn't line up with the one in the headlines. Why bury her beneath the floor? A man trying to flee wouldn't choose the hardest possible hiding place. Why leave the cabin in perfect order, food stocked, beds made, clothes folded, as if life had been paused, not destroyed? And if Jacob had truly snapped, why not take the rifle with him? Why leave the murder weapon inches from where he supposedly buried his wife? Keene flipped through the old reports. 14 years earlier, investigators had walked through that same cabin without ever opening the floor. He circled a line from the 1994 notes. Interior neat, no sign of struggle, cabin not processed for prints. Not processed. That small oversight had shaped everything, the search, the theories, the public story. For 14 years, the truth had been buried less than a foot beneath the boards, and no one had looked. Keene visited the cabin himself the next morning. The site was still surrounded by tape, the ground scarred from the recovery dig. Inside, the air hung heavy with the residue of bleach and soil. He crouched near the open crawl space, shining his flashlight along the dirt. The beam caught something small, a child's marble, half buried, blue glass dulled by dust. He turned it over in his palm, frowning. The detail wasn't in any report. He wrote it in his notebook anyway. Sometimes he'd learned the smallest things told the biggest stories. Standing in the center of the empty cabin, he tried to picture what had really happened here. The moment before the silence began, the stove still smelled faintly of ash. The boards creaked as he shifted his weight. He whispered under his breath, not to anyone but to the air itself. Why did no one ever look down? Outside, the wind pushed through the clearing, carrying with it the faint hum of the generator from the forensic tent. For the first time in 14 years, the investigation had a body, but Detective Keene had the feeling it was only the beginning. 2 weeks after the discovery beneath the cabin, the case seemed to take an unexpected turn. Late one evening, a pair of backcountry hikers radioed the Fairbanks Trooper Station to report what looked like an old vehicle at the bottom of a ravine. The coordinates they gave placed it nearly 80 miles from the Harroway homestead, deep inside terrain so rugged it appeared on no official maps. The recovery team arrived the next morning. A helicopter hovered low over the treetops, lowering investigators by harness to a narrow patch of rock. The sight that greeted them was grim. Wedged between boulders and brush lay the crumpled remains of a green Ford pickup, half swallowed by moss and rust. The front end was sheared open, the windshield gone, doors twisted like foil. The serial number on the chassis matched the Harroway's missing truck. Inside the shattered cab, technicians found a tangle of debris, a child's rain boot with faded blue stripes, a rusted rifle still in its case, a thermos crushed flat. In the bed of the truck sat two sealed metal containers, both dented and streaked with a dark residue that shimmered in the light. When the containers were opened at the lab, the stench of chemical solvents filled the room. By evening, the department had its narrative ready. The official report read like a conclusion instead of a beginning. Jacob Harroway, mentally deteriorating after years of isolation, had murdered his wife, loaded his children into the truck, and driven off the cliff in a final act of desperation. The sealed containers, they suggested, contained the same toxins that had slowly poisoned his family and driven him insane. The media loved it. The mad homesteader of Alaska, one headline declared. Television anchors spoke of the tragic descent of a once brilliant man into wilderness-induced madness. It was a story that fit perfectly, clean, sensational, and finished. But for Detective Rowan Keene, it didn't fit at all. He stood at the edge of the ravine that afternoon, squinting into the low gray light as investigators packed up. From above, the crash looked plausible. A long drop, jagged rocks, the kind of place where accidents became burials. Yet something about the scene felt wrong. He walked the rim of the cliff, tracing the supposed path of the truck. The soil was firm, untouched except for the footprints of troopers, no gouges from tires, no disturbed gravel, no evidence of acceleration. A vehicle driven off at speed would have left deep ruts and a churned lip of dirt. There was nothing. Keene crouched near the edge, studying the slope. The angle was too shallow to explain the crushed front end unless the vehicle had gained speed from somewhere else. But the ravine was boxed in. No room for a running start. He jotted a note. Impact velocity inconsistent with free fall trajectory. He called down to the forensics team. Did anyone check the underside of the frame? Already did, one of the technicians shouted back. Looks like corrosion, old damage. Keene shook his head. Not all of it. Those dents are fresh. Look at the scrape marks. Different color metal. He could feel the narrative shifting under his boots. That night, back at his desk, he went through the photographs one by one, the truck's crushed roof, the rifle on the passenger seat, the neat arrangement of the children's clothing, not strewn, but folded, like props placed for the camera. The containers, both oddly clean compared to the rest of the wreckage. their seals almost intact despite a supposed 14-year exposure. Someone had wanted the truck to be found and found now. Keene brought his doubts to his superior, Lieutenant Dowell. The older man listened, then sighed. Rowan, it's been 14 years. The family's gone, the body's accounted for, and now we've got the vehicle. We can finally close this thing. Let the dead rest. Except they won't, Keene said, because this wasn't a crash. It was staged. Dahl gave him the kind of look reserved for men too stubborn for their own good. You're seeing ghosts. Don't start chasing conspiracies in the woods. The public needs closure. But Keene couldn't let it go. He requested the mechanical report from the recovery team and spent the next 2 nights cross-referencing impact data with environmental conditions. The numbers didn't align. The deformation pattern on the hood showed compression from above, not from forward velocity. It was the kind of crush that happened when a vehicle was dropped or rolled, not driven. The following morning, he returned to the site alone, descending the slope by rope. The forest was silent, except for the distant murmur of wind in the treetops. He circled the truck, brushing away moss until he found what he was looking for, the tow hook on the front bumper. It was bent backward, the metal warped in a way that suggested force from a cable or chain. He stared at it for a long moment. Someone had pulled this vehicle to the cliff, rolled it over the edge, and left it as a false grave. When he climbed back to the ridge, he looked out over the endless stretch of pines and frozen river valleys. Somewhere out there, the rest of the Harroway family still waited, not lost, but hidden. Back in Fairbanks, the press conference went ahead without him. Lieutenant Dahl stood before microphones, the missing persons photos displayed on an easel beside him. The evidence is consistent with a tragic end, Dahl told the cameras. The Harroway family story is now closed. Keene watched from the back of the room, jaw tight. Every word sounded rehearsed, every detail too convenient. When the reporters dispersed, he walked past the podium and left the station without a word. Outside, the cold bit into his skin. The wind carried the faint smell of exhaust and snow. He lit a cigarette and stared at the horizon. The case wasn't closed. It had just been buried again, this time under paperwork instead of earth. Somewhere between the cabin and the ravine lay the real story, and Keene knew it would take more than headlines to dig it up. He flicked the cigarette into the snow, watching it hiss and vanish. Then he whispered to himself the same way he had in the cabin. They didn't die here. Someone wanted us to think they did. And with that, the detective turned back toward his car, already planning where he would look next. The crash report was barely cold when Detective Rowan Keene asked for access to the evidence locker again. He'd spent nights replaying the details in his head. The staged crash, the rifle, the containers. Every piece felt intentional, as if someone had arranged the scene to whisper a single false story. At the far end of the evidence room, under yellowing labels and dust, lay a small box marked "Recovered from Harroway Cabin, 1994. It had been ignored for years, sealed and forgotten. Keene pried the lid open and began to sort through its contents. A few personal photographs, a child's drawing of the cabin, and a weathered leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and smudged with dirt. On the first page, written in Jacob Harroway's precise block letters, were numbers, columns of temperature readings, pH levels, and dates. Each entry followed the same pattern. Well water, lower clearing, sample 3. Slight metallic taste, possible contamination. The further Keene read, the darker the entries became. Jacob had noted that his youngest son Eli had begun suffering from nausea, headaches, and painful rashes. The family suspected spoiled food at first, but when the symptoms persisted, Jacob grew obsessed with their water source. He'd started testing the well himself using crude chemical strips, writing down each change he observed. The final entry stopped Keene cold. Something in the well makes the kids sick, source unknown, samples ready to send. If this is man-made, someone needs to answer for it. Beneath the line was a name and an address, almost faded to nothing. Roland Jessup, Anchorage Daily Tribune. Keene shut the notebook and stared at the name for a long time. He knew Jessup, at least he knew of him. In the 90s, Jessup had been an investigative journalist who specialized in environmental exposés, corporate leaks, illegal dumping, black market waste contracts. He'd vanished from the public eye in 1997, quitting at the peak of his career. No explanation, no farewell article, just gone. That afternoon, Keene found Jessup's last known address on an old personnel directory, a small town south of Anchorage, population under 500. He drove out the next morning. The road wound along a frozen inlet, cliffs dropping steeply to the gray water below. When he reached the town, the only sign of life was a diner with fogged windows and a gas station that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. Jessup's house sat half buried in snow at the edge of the woods. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. Keene parked, knocked, and waited. The man who opened the door looked far older than his 60 years, eyes sunken, hair thin, body hunched like he'd been hiding from the world for too long. "I'm Detective Keene," Rowan said, showing his badge. "I'm investigating the Harroway case. You may have known them." Jessup's eyes flickered, a brief flash of recognition, followed by something else. Fear. He hesitated, then opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The inside smelled of stale coffee and wood smoke. Papers were stacked everywhere, boxes of old clippings, unopened mail, photographs of toxic spill sites and protest rallies from another lifetime. Jessup poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, his hands trembling slightly. "I figured one day someone would show up asking about that family." He spoke quietly, like a man confessing something he'd rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. In late 1994, he said, he'd received a package at the Tribune office. Inside were 3 sealed vials of soil and water, a handwritten letter, and a series of photographs. Jacob Harroway had written that his well water had turned oily and sweet-smelling. His children were getting sick. He'd tested the samples himself and found traces of heavy metals. He begged Jessup to investigate, writing, "If they're dumping something here, it's not just us who'll die from it." Jessup had planned to send the samples to a lab in Anchorage. He'd even drafted the first outline for an article. Then the threats started, anonymous calls at home, letters with no return address. One night, someone broke into his office and left a dead raven on his desk. The message was clear, Jessup said, staring into his cup. "Drop it, or your kids are next." He resigned from the paper 2 weeks later, moved to this forgotten town, tried to pretend it never happened. Keene sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of a wall clock. "Do you still have the samples?" he asked finally. Jessup nodded slowly. "I could never bring myself to throw them away." He led Keene down a narrow hall to a storage room filled with boxes. From the back of a shelf, he pulled out a sealed evidence envelope, brittle with age. Inside were 3 glass vials and Jacob's letter, still folded neatly. The ink had faded, but the words were legible. "If I'm right, it's not the cold that will kill us. It's what's buried under it." Keene took the evidence straight to the state forensic lab under police custody. The technicians handled the samples with sterile gloves, logging each one carefully. When the results came back, the findings were staggering. The soil and water from the Harroway property contained abnormally high levels of heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic, but it was the chemical signature that stood out. The samples also contained chlorinated hydrocarbon solvents, compounds used almost exclusively in military waste disposal during the Cold War. The mixture was not something that occurred naturally, nor something a civilian could have accessed. In short, the Harroways had been living atop a poisoned landscape. The contamination likely originated from buried barrels of toxic waste, dumped illegally decades earlier. The chemicals had leached into the groundwater, slowly poisoning the soil and the family's well. Keene stared at the lab report for a long time, tracing the printed lines with his finger. This was the missing link, the reason Jacob had become obsessed, the reason for the family's mysterious illnesses, and perhaps the reason they had disappeared. He could almost picture it. Jacob realizing what was happening, taking samples, sending them to Jessup, and then silence. Someone had found out. He knew too much. The connection was too direct to ignore. The same military-grade solvents found in the Harroway's well had also been identified decades earlier at one of the decommissioned waste sites west of Fairbanks, a site once managed by a private defense contractor. Keene filed for access to the contractor's disposal records, but the request was denied within hours. The reason given: classified federal material. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. They weren't dealing with an accident anymore. This was deliberate. Someone had been dumping restricted waste where no one would look, on land so remote it wouldn't be found for generations, and the Harroways had found it by mistake. Keene opened Jacob's notebook again, staring at the last entry. Something in the well makes the kids sick. The line wasn't paranoia, it was proof. For 14 years, the world had believed the wilderness had taken the Harroways. Now Keene knew better. It wasn't nature that killed them, it was man. And somewhere out there, the men who did it were still alive. Detective Rowan Keene didn't sleep much after the lab results came back. The numbers kept replaying in his head. Levels of lead and mercury so high they could strip the lining off pipes. Chemical traces used only in government waste contracts. He knew what that meant. Somewhere, someone had signed off on a cleanup that never happened. He spent weeks combing through procurement logs, shipping manifests, and archived defense contracts. Most were routine, a few weren't. In 1995, a $3.4 million payment had been approved for the safe removal and transport of hazardous solvents from a decommissioned research site north of Fairbanks. The job was marked completed. The receiving facility, when Keene called, had no record of any such shipment. The money was gone, so were the chemicals. Cross-referencing the authorizations led Keene to 3 names: Colonel Cyrus Brick, Major Taryn Forrester, and Captain Ephraim Lynch, all listed as project officers for the disposal contract. Each had since retired comfortably, living quiet lives spread across Alaska and the lower states. Keene began to pull their files. Brick had become a consultant for a private logistics firm, Forrester ran a defense supply company, and Lynch lived alone outside Anchorage, off the same grid he had once used to hide his crimes. Piece by piece, the pattern emerged. The 3 men had falsified the records, pocketed the money, and dumped the waste themselves, somewhere remote enough to disappear forever. They'd chosen a drainage basin surrounded by state land, a place with no oversight and almost no residents. The Harroway family unknowingly had built their cabin downstream from it. Jacob must have stumbled on the dumping site while hunting. barrels leaking from the thawing ground, the smell of solvent heavy in the air, his samples, his letters, his growing fear now made sense. And when the men realized he knew what they'd done, they silenced him. Keene imagined the sequence: Jacob following a trail of dead vegetation until he reached the clearing. A truck parked there that didn't belong. 3 men in military fatigues loading barrels. Words exchanged, confusion turning to recognition, then gunfire echoing across the valley. Jacob's body was never found. Too much time had passed, too much snow and earth moved since that day. But the truth of his death was written in the chemicals that poisoned his children. The rest of the puzzle fell into place with terrible clarity. After killing Jacob, the men went to the cabin to erase the evidence. Maren was there with the children. She never had a chance to run. The shot to her chest was deliberate, efficient, military. They buried her beneath the floor, knowing the frozen soil would preserve her long enough to frame Jacob later if anyone ever looked. The children were taken, hostages at first, then liabilities. They were never seen again. When the case went cold and public interest faded, the men left the bodies near the contaminated site and walked away. 14 years later, when renewed attention threatened to expose their scheme, they staged the discovery of the truck in the ravine, planting evidence that would finally bury the story. It might have worked if not for one line in Jacob's notebook and one detective who refused to stop reading. Keene assembled his findings into a report thick enough to break a desk. He brought it to the district attorney, who stared at the evidence in silence before nodding. Arrest warrants were issued under federal authority. The raids happened simultaneously. Forrester was taken at his home outside Anchorage before dawn, dragged out in his bathrobe while agents tore through his filing cabinets. Lynch tried to run but was cornered in his truck on a back road. Inside, they found photographs of the Harroway property and old maps of the disposal site. Colonel Brick was the last, found in his office in Seattle, staring blankly at a wall of framed commendations. Confronted with the records, the men denied everything. But forensic accountants traced the missing funds, and when investigators dug into the coordinates Keene had marked, they found what was left of the dumping ground: rows of rusted barrels split open like eggshells, their contents seeping into the earth. Nearby, buried in shallow graves, were the small skeletons of 3 children. DNA confirmed what Keene already knew. Lydia, Rowan, and Eli Harroway had been found. The courtroom was packed during the trial. The evidence was overwhelming: the falsified disposal manifests, the shell companies, the matching ballistics from Jacob's rifle found at the scene. Under pressure, Captain Lynch finally broke, confessing in exchange for leniency. His statement filled in the final awful details. He described how they dumped the waste under cover of darkness, how Jacob had walked into their operation, how Brick had given the order to contain the problem. He told of Maren's death, the burial under the cabin, the children's cries, the staged crash years later. Each sentence peeled away another layer of the lie the world had believed for 14 years. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Evelyn Harroway wasn't in the courtroom. She had chosen not to see their faces again. Instead, she returned to the clearing where the cabin still stood, smaller now under the weight of time. Snow drifted down from a gray sky, settling on the roof she had patched for so many years. She stood at the edge of the porch, her breath rising in small clouds. The forest around her was silent, except for the wind through the pines. For the first time, she didn't feel the place watching her. It was just a house again, empty, ordinary, no longer haunted by what she didn't know. She knelt in the snow and pressed her palm to the frozen ground. "It's over," she whispered, though she knew that wasn't true. Justice had come, but it hadn't brought anyone back. When she finally rose, flakes clung to her coat and hair. She looked once more at the cabin, the windows blank, the door she'd painted years ago, now faded to the color of ash. "The wilderness never took them," she said softly, her voice almost carried away by the wind. "People did." The snow fell harder then, covering her footprints as she walked back to the jeep. By the time she reached the road, the clearing was white again, quiet and untouched, as if nothing had ever happened there at all. And for the first time in 14 years, the forest kept its silence out of peace, not fear. The Harroway case would go on to become one of Alaska's most haunting reminders of how silence protects power. For years, people spoke of it as a wilderness mystery, another family swallowed by the cold, another tragedy blamed on nature's indifference. But the wilderness had never been the villain. It was paperwork, closed files, the quiet convenience of calling something an accident instead of an atrocity. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't come from a headline or a press release. It came from a notebook, a few forgotten vials, and one detective who refused to accept a story that fit too neatly. Detective Rowan Keene would later say that the hardest part wasn't proving who killed the Harroways. It was proving that the world had stopped looking too soon. In the years that followed, environmental reforms were drafted, committees formed, promises made. But none of it changed the simple fact that the Harroways' names were carved not into stone, but into the cold soil of their land. The same ground that poisoned them, the same ground that hid their truth. Evelyn Harroway's words still echo in investigative circles. The wilderness never took them, people did. And so the story ends where it began, in a clearing deep in Alaska's interior, snow falling quietly over a cabin that outlasted everyone who ever called it home. As the wind moves through the pines, the narrator's voice lowers. The wild is harsh, but never as cruel as greed.